Hi, I'm Jim Stout.
And I'm Mike Acosta.
And welcome to the very first episode of Gear Chat. Today we're going to be taking a look at the famous Yamaha DX7. So in this video we're going to be talking really just about the DX7, cool, famous sounds, and pretty much just our opinions of it. So how did you first hear about this?
Honestly, for me, I didn't start producing music till maybe like the early to mid 90s. So by that time, obviously the DX7 had already passed, and around that time it was more of like the digital modules, like the EMU modules that were coming out, more the digital synthesizers.
Like the Proteus and stuff?
Yeah, and all that kind of stuff. And I was still really new to it, so I was just trying to like make records and, basically get my feet wet. So I didn't really even understand everything about synthesis. I knew what it was, but if you asked me to make a sound, I was just the guy that was just pulling up presets and kind of just navigating around. So when I finally kind of started learning a little bit more about it, I just remember the DX7, I would always like associate it with, oh, that's that ugly brown looking keyboard, It wasn't until later on where I started, learning more about it that I started hearing some of the tones, and then other friends would tell me, oh, that's from, a DX7 or something like that. And then that's when I started to kind of like understand it, a little more, and the kind of like more sharp metallic sounds that were coming out from it and stuff, so.
Yeah, for me it was mainly, I started in 85, 86, somewhere around there, and it was always kind of this legendary synth. I'd heard of the mini Moogs and the emulators and all these kind of things, and the first time, back in the 80s when you saw this thing, it looked magical. It looked something from the future. It was all sleek and dialed in, and these membrane switches were like a huge thing in the early 80s, but they were just highly unreliable. They'll wear out. Yeah. But I always thought it was just such a cool, futuristic piece of technology, and I was just fascinated by it. I think a lot of the sounds were not really that impressive by themselves. So when I first heard it, I was like, I was kind of really excited about the D50.
Oh, yeah.
So this was like 86, and I had heard that ROMs was going to come out with a new synth, and this would be really, really cool. So, when you put this up next to a D50, in like 1987,
yeah,
the D50 smashes it. But that's not really where, in my opinion, the character of this synth comes into play. It's been on probably every famous record in the 80s, and then some. I think, from a dance perspective, I think a lot of the other guys were rocking into like the DX100s and.
Yeah, and that's where I really kind of got turned on to the DX series. Period. Like with FM synthesis was, I was trying to figure out at that particular time. Like I always wondered how. The sound of Roger in Zap, with the talk box and stuff like that. And then, I saw a few images, and, I had heard it was a DX7 and then all this other stuff. And then I heard from other guys that it was a DX100, so that's kind of like made me start paying a bit more attention, to it as to, what was it doing and, what made it so special, so.
Yeah, and I wanted to kind of, touch on that. This was probably... definitely go down in synthesizer history as one of the most successful and famous synthesizers ever. It definitely changed the game, because, before this thing came out, in 83, there really wasn't a lot of stuff. You had the Prophet 5, you had a few other synths that were out, but there was nothing like this, nothing that gave you 16 notes of polyphony, able to recall 64 sounds immediately. Right. You got a display to tell you what it is and a numeric value, so you can see it in the dark. This DX7 has been updated. It's I put a new backlight in it, but the original DX7, the backlight's not lit, so it was really, really hard to see in low light. And then it had just one data entry, and when it first came out, nobody programmed it, Nobody had really any idea. When you're coming from analog synthesis and you take a look at this, you're like, what the hell is all?
I still look at it like, what the hell is all this? Like, you know.
But that's where I think a lot of the charm comes into play, is because nobody programmed it. So the presets in here were used on
Every
hundreds
record,
of tracks.
yeah.
Hundreds of famous tracks. And I have to admit this, the Berlin bass line, I never knew it was the DX7. When I was like, oh man, I really like that bass sound. And I never realized it was a DX7. It had been mixed and, added chorus and these kind of things to it. And it sounded just really, really cool, but it's here. And this was just a preset. It was preset number 18, fretless bass. And it is, what was it? There it is. Boom, boom. That's it.
Yeah, it's real simple too, and it's just like, wow.
Yeah, and then things like, a lot of the hip hop guys were using it. I remember Cool Mo D.
Yeah, Wild Wild West.
One of the other famous songs that it was used in was it was just a huge hit, and probably it's I would say it's the equivalent to Stairway to Heaven, but for keyboard players.
Yeah.
No Axel F allowed to be played in a music store.
That's right. Beverly Hills Cop.
Yep. So the bass lines and all the bells and the marimba sounds were all from this. And they were all just the presets, and you can hear them plain as day. Find the trumpet, marimba.
Depeche Mode.
Yeah, it's just right there. But they used it in, Janet Jackson tracks. The timpani was legendary. That's pretty cool. Let's see if we can find. Is it called Tube Erupt? I just thought it was Tubular Bells. Yep.
Still sounds amazing.
It does. You never thought you'd actually say digital kind of sounds warm, but
yeah.
This compared to listening out of other stuff.
Yeah, it's nice. I mean, it has that really tight low end on it, but it also has that real metallic, sharp, like percussive, attack on it on the top end. So it's like you have the top and the low, and so that's where you would fill it in the middle with other stuff. But I mean, it really cuts through. I mean, again, another thing too, like I said, I started producing music like early to mid 90s, and I remember that for bass lines at that time, my partner that I was, doing stuff with, he had a Yamaha DX81Z, and so right over there, and so. The lately bass, was being used in all the hip house records from Chicago and stuff like that. And I remember we would use it a lot. And again, that kind of focused back to like some of the bass sounds that came from the DX7. And so finally, when I did get a chance to, really sit down with a DX7 and go through the sounds, every time you start playing in the lower octaves of those basses, and like even that fretless bass, it just punches through, and the low end on it is so tight. It's like you don't really need compression when you listen to it. It's pretty much like right in the pocket there. You don't have to really process it too much. I mean, at least in my opinion,
Yeah, I for the electric pianos and stuff like that, I always kind of feel like a good chorus on them will make it a million times better. But like the electric pianos were immediate Whitney Houston.
Oh yeah.
It's a great sounding instrument, and I think it's, for me, it just looks cool. It's just a cool time in history. A lot of people say, oh, the DX7 killed analog synthesizers. No, it didn't. And, oh, that's thin piece of crap, digital DX7. I don't like that digital crap. Whatever. Fine. But it sounds
awesome. Yeah, I mean, you have to love everything about instruments, whether it's 100% analog or if it was a hybrid or if it was digital. I mean, every single instrument, you know, had its own little niche, you know, and
this one had a huge niche.
Yeah, you know, and what it, you know, brought to music and whatnot. So, I mean, you know, there's a lot of cool things about analog and, you know, that, you know, digital just doesn't have. And there's a lot of things that digital does that, you know, analog doesn't.
Well, I mean, it's nice to see the, you know, the resurgence in decent analog synths, but back then, you know, you got to remember that a lot of the analog synths were just a giant pain in the ass. They would go out of tune, they would overheat, there were massive problems with them. You know, stuff trying to stay in sync.
Yeah, not really reliable, especially if you were touring or, you know, having to move them around a lot.
And this was actually the third synthesizer to ever have MIDI. It was number 3. The Prophet 600 was the first one. The Jupiter 6 was the second one, and the DX7 was the third synth to have MIDI. So by the time the MIDI was real primitive on the Jupiter 6 and the Prophet 600, they've done some updates to the firmware and stuff like the Jupiter 6. You got the Europa mod and these kind of things. But there was a weird thing. The Jupiter 6 before the Europa mod, you had to do like these weird things. You had to take a MIDI cable from the out to the input, hold down the first 3 keys and turn it on, and that would set it to omni-off poly. So it would respond to one MIDI channel. Otherwise, it would respond to, you know, omni-on, and all 16 MIDI channels would be
firing off.
So that was always a pain in the ass, so you never turned it off. In here, you were able to change the MIDI channels, do all this other kind of stuff. But in the original OS version of this, there's an issue with the velocity. The velocity max, I think, is like 110 or 117. It doesn't go to a full 127. So this one's been updated. It's got the latest firmware and special edition stuff in there. So it's got a full 127 on velocity on the output.
Now, how many of like, I know it takes a voice ROM cartridge and everything. How many of those were actually?
I think
made?
It originally shipped with. I've got another one here. This is voice ROM 4. So yeah, I think there were 4 original ROM chips that came with it, and these just had all the factory sounds. Well, not came with it, but they were able to buy. So each one of these had 64 sounds in it. You had an A and a B bank. So these would, I mean, you couldn't write to them, you just plug them in and get going. But again, that's what everybody used because you couldn't program this thing. This one has orchestral, percussive group, and complex and effects group. So all these sounds are available online, and you can load them into the FM8 and things like that. But it still doesn't. It's still not as cool as this.
No, it definitely doesn't sound exactly the same. FM8 is really cool from Native Instruments, and you can program it, in the same way that you see the architecture here for every, for the algorithms. Mm-hmm. But like, honestly, for me, to this day, I still don't go near like programming, an FM synth. I just
they're kind of interesting.
As I look at it here, and even looking at it in FM8, I thought it would be an easier approach. And I don't know, for some reason, just the way that I see it, I just always see it as a huge nightmare trying to program it.
Pretty. I mean, the way it breaks down is kind of like this. So you have to think of the kind of sound that you want to make first, and you kind of have to know what these algorithms do. And from a real basic standpoint, let's say you want to make an organ sound. Organ sounds are really pure tones. They're really easy. So you would take something that is going to be mainly carriers. Mm-hmm. So that's the two terms, carriers and modulators in FM. So the carrier is like the oscillator, and the modulator is what makes the carrier do all kinds of crazy stuff to get those kind of crazy waveforms. So you can see that some of these other algorithms in here, some of them feed back on themselves, some of them do all kinds of crazy crap. So
I'm hearing stuff like a dog, man.
So you can edit this and come in here and take off. And as you add it in, so this is algorithm 4.
Right.
So it's got, it's 2 carriers and then 4 modulators. So that's really pretty much, and if you take off the first 2, you shouldn't Yeah, so you can't hear anything because there's no carriers, it's just modulators left. So we'll bring in the carrier. Hear how that upper end starts to get tweaked out. So that's lower end, and then
it's where you get that real top end sparkle on it and stuff.
Tweaking stuff out.
Yeah, nice.
So then you start getting into the ratios and the envelopes and the breakpoints of everything, and you get to some really, really cool stuff, but you can't think about it like analog.
No, yeah, it's way different. That's why I haven't been able to really get in and program.
Nobody does.
Really good stuff.
But there's been a few. So another famous sound a lot of people get confused with is the original synclavier. That the Michael Jackson Beat It and stuff. That was FM synthesis, and kind of predates the DX series just by a smooch here, but mono output.
Yeah.
And it's crazy, and it weighs like a freaking metric ton.
Oh yeah, that's the one thing I noticed too. It's got some serious weight to it, but the keys feel really nice on it, and so it's definitely been cool for me, like just kind of going through and listening to some of these sounds, because I personally don't own one, so whenever I'm listening to some of this stuff, like I've got like some of the patches that you sent me, and then imported those into FM8. Which is pretty cool. So if you don't know that, if you have Native Instruments FM8, you can actually get a lot of the factory presets or patches that have been made for the DX7, and you can actually import them into FM8 and get those sounds, which is pretty cool. So, but it's definitely not the same like being right here and playing on this thing and hearing it. There is a difference, but
yeah.
That's all like the 80s horror movies and those action thriller kind of things. John Carpenter, it's definitely very, very cool.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things I read a long time ago, Trent Reznor was I can't remember which tour it was, but he was buying DX7s for like I don't know, $25 or something stupid, and he would just bring them on stage and trash them. They were like a prop. He did this whole tour just buying up all these old DX7s apparently, and then just trashing them on stage. So
ouch.
Yeah. So like anything, the longer time goes on, the more rare they become. But I think they sold well over 100,000 of these things.
Oh.
So there's still quite a lot out there. But
yeah.
It's, in my opinion, it's a very, very special synthesizer in the world.
What are they going for now, like on eBay and stuff?
Depends on the condition and what they have with them. I think they go anywhere between 200 to 500, somewhere around there. But you find one like in like amazing condition. I bought this one in Austin maybe about 8 years ago, and the guy bought it brand new in 1986 and then never touched it. So it sat in his closet untouched. We have the original brochures and
I've seen it. It's in really, really good condition.
Yeah, it's mint. I mean, even all the data entry knobs and everything not knobs, but data entry sliders are happening, and the wheels aren't wobbly. So yeah, it's definitely a definite score on it. And then you can't see it in here, but we've got another DX7 2FD that came out in '87, which was basically two of these, an A and B bank, and they supposedly cleaned up the outputs and all this kind of stuff. I think it was weird. Like '80s was, people were chasing fidelity.
Yeah, it was all about trying to get that better digital quality or like that hi-fi sound.
Yeah. Yeah, so they were like, that was in all the marketing campaigns of every piece of gear. It's like, oh, we went and cleaned up the gear, cleaned up the waveforms and improved the output stage and this and that, and using a new converter with a higher sample rate and blah, blah, blah. And so, here it is 2016, and, all we want is like 12-bit samplers and bit crushers and shit.
Yeah, to get a lot of that old character back.
I think it's a good thing now. I mean, like a combination of using like the original gear and today's recording stuff, I think it works out great because you get that character. And whether or not somebody can tell if it was a real DX7 or not, I don't care.
Yeah.
You know, I just don't give a shit. I like, oh, that's not a real. Who cares? If you can never tell the difference, I'll give you $1. But for me personally, that's not the point. It's like I like vibing on the gear. You know, everything's got a personality.
Oh yeah, definitely.
You know? And this is when they, you know, really designed instruments. You know, so much work went into this thing. And to bring it in at a price point, I think it was like $2,000, 1995 or 1895 when it first launched in '83.
That's about the equivalent.
$83, yeah, $1983. I'll have to find out.
$2,000 back then was probably like how much now? Like
we'll find it. We'll find out and we'll put it on the.
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty expensive, you know.
Yeah. I think the synthesizer had found its way into every genre of music.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Pop, obviously, a lot of electronic cats, but like the country music stars were using it. It was a whole hell of a lot lighter than dragging around a Rhodes.
Oh yeah.
You know, but then you get the purists who start coming out. Well, it doesn't sound like no, of course it doesn't sound like a real Rhodes. You know, you're not going to be able to tell at a country western.
Yeah.
It's like no one cares, but it really is. It's an amazing piece of history. It's really wild to go back and listen to the raw sounds of some of the biggest selling platinum records of all time.
Yeah, definitely.
And they were just all the presets. So I guess that kind of puts that whole preset, I guess controversy to bed.
Yeah, I mean, I personally, like, when I first started out, that's all I did was use presets. You know, I didn't understand synthesis. I didn't understand, like, really getting in there and programming a synth. And especially with a lot of the digital modules, you had to really menu dive, to find all these parameters and functions. And I remember that I would start exploring, and I would just get lost. I didn't know what anything meant. And I remember back then, too, there was no YouTube. There wasn't, videos like this where we're talking about gear or where you could go find out about it. You just had this massive manual to kind of read through and figure it out.
This was, these were my YouTubes back then. This was Keyboard Magazine. They had all the stuff in here, and they would advertise. I think I've got one somewhere. Oh yeah, these are remnants. But that was the back page of Keyboard Magazine. It was the DX7, and then on the inside cover was the DW6000.
Nice.
Yeah, that didn't last long. It was mostly the 8000.
Have you had a chance to actually play with the Yamaha Reface?
I've not played with it in person because there's not a decent music store anymore.
I saw some reviews of it, and a lot of it, from what I heard, because I've seen some guys like put the DX7 right next to it, and I'm just like, yeah, you shouldn't have even done that, because, like, from what I heard, the DX7 just smashes that thing. Like, it didn't even come close. Like,
in my opinion, how much are those things? Like the Reface series?
I'm not sure. I'd say less than $5.
I mean, so you can buy a real DX7 for that.
Yeah, true.
Granted, it's bigger and whatnot, but it's fine. But I would much rather have this. It's not like I travel around with keyboards anymore.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I think they're trying to recapture some of that stuff.
Oh, yeah.
But
I can only imagine if it was a nightmare to try to program on here, trying to go on the little Reface, man.
It doesn't have just pressure buttons or something.
I think so. Yeah, like it's really, really stripped down, really clean. Again, and I think the whole premise for that is obviously this was all about just the presets. They didn't really expect you to be on here programming.
Dude, they absolutely did. I think they absolutely built this so you would program your own sounds on it, or else they put all of the features, they put everything in here. Even though this looks like in 1983, when you saw this looked like some kind of alien writing.
Oh yeah, it still does.
Yeah, true. But a lot of people made some good money programming patches for these things. Some people who understood them, and obviously because I've got a crap load.
Yeah, no, I think definitely there's there was those guys out there, but I think the majority of the guys that were, gigging out live, that were looking at this as a much smaller portable solution, to have all those sounds, a combination of like, real world instruments and then some synthesized things. It was really just about pulling up the presets, quickly and being able to change them. I mean, I feel like when, the whole digital synth era started coming into play was really about, quick, easy access to a lot of presets fast. I mean, obviously, I don't
know if it was so much about that as it was just being able to recall sounds. That was like
same thing. Quick access to presets.
Well, but I don't think people were all like, quick access to presets. I think they were thinking, oh, look, that's my piano sound. I can always hit that button and get that piano sound. It's like rat paw. You just say, I know I can do this. When I do this, I get this result.
Right.
And in all honesty, I think there were probably only maybe 7 sounds that people would use in this. Even though they had all these other, crazy things.
Well, remember too, back then, obviously, Jim and I both worked at Roland for, a really long time. And, the history behind a lot of these synthesizers, was the Japanese engineers were ultimately trying to emulate real world, acoustic instruments.
Hence the name synthesizer.
Yeah, and what we have come to love them for is not what the Japanese engineers had initially intended them for.
I think
these will be around for a long time. Whether how they're used will change. Yeah. I think is more the question. Obviously with technology advancing so much, I just think that the way that this particular instrument will be used or how it gets incorporated into, the studio environment 15, 20 years from now will definitely be different and will be interesting to see, because the way that audio is delivered now, the way that MIDI is being sent now, all of these different things and the way that sounds are, there may be new technologies that will allow you to take something like this and who knows what you'll be able to do with it, Yeah,
I mean, it's an interesting kind of perspective. I don't, as far as the future, what it really holds, I mean, if you would have told me, back in the 80s that, you can do everything in the computer, I would have been like, I don't see how. Because you need I was thinking like, consoles and mixers and all the components go into it. But sure enough, it's all here and you don't even need, the stack of these, synthesizers anymore. But I have them just because I think they're, in my opinion, a studio is not just a computer. It's just like, these are instruments for me. They're, they're, like I said, they all have character. They're all really unique. And then when you do record them, they sound good.
Yeah, no, definitely. There's definitely a difference between, taking one of these units, playing something live and then, tracking it in versus, using a software emulation of it. And it's not to say that the software emulations are bad.
No.
A lot of them do it really well.
This technically is all software.
Yeah.
There's not really an analog component in here other than the, the op amps that go in here. But this is a fully, digital instrument. And
that is true.
It's some of the parts that makes it something kind of unique. It's the casing, and especially when you play it and you feel it, it sounds different.
Oh yeah, all of that goes hand in hand. It's that whole
I agree.
touch experience along, the senses and then what you're hearing and everything.
It's definitely an experience. So that, getting back to like some of the sounds, that's on the Janet Jackson stuff and the marimba stuff. It was just everywhere. It was just freaking everywhere.
This about wraps up our first little gear chat, kind of touching on the DX7. Again, and the whole point with this is we want to touch base on some of the classic stuff, vintage synthesizers, anything that we feel was kind of cool, and talk about some of the reasons why. These videos won't be so much on, it does this and blah, 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 and getting too technical about it. We really want to just speak from the heart about why we love some of these instruments or why we hate them or certain things about it that we just couldn't stand. And so it'll be a combination of like classic vintage stuff with the stuff of today, you know, with the new gear and what we think and, you know, how it relates to us and what we feel about it. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, who knows what will be coming down the pipe. I mean, we've got some other classic synths that we're going to be bringing out too, but you know, going forward, it should be a lot of cool stuff.
Yeah, I'd like to maybe do a follow-up on the DX7 with the
DX7 too.
Yeah, and kind of play it, you know, maybe have them side to side and maybe do a little bit of A/B comparison and stuff. So.
It just I mean, the funny thing is the DX7 2 is basically the DX1. The DX1 was 2 DX7s in one, and then they also had a DX5, which was the same thing as the DX1, but it didn't have the weighted keys. It had synth action keys and a 76-note keyboard. Ask me why I know all this shit.
Yeah, dude, you're like the encyclopedia of like 80s synthesizers. And if you enjoyed this video, and along with the other free tutorials that we have, some of the first look videos where we take a look at new software, new gear that's right on the market, make sure you subscribe to the ADSR channel so that you stay up to date with all the latest news and tutorials and courses that we have on adsrsounds.com.